What happens when the human heart confronts the power of the divine? What occurs when a decision challenges the pillars of faith, and the oldest stories of humanity encounter the weight of eternal judgment? From the deserts to the thrones of powerful queens, these questions have shaped the destiny of women whose courage and defiance left an indelible mark on Scripture. In the vast tapestry of the Quran, women are not silent figures but voices, decisions, and destinies torn between obedience and questioning. They mirror humanity, carriers of faith and doubt, love and contradiction. Among them, 3 women stand out as enigmas. Their stories, marked by conflict and transcendence, illuminate the complexities of human paths. A queen whose wisdom rivaled that of prophets, a wife who rejected the warning of the flood, and another whose backward glance sealed her fate forever. These accounts are not mere religious anecdotes, but human stories woven with threads of power, love, and faith confronted with eternal judgment. Each of these women not only defied the norms of their time but also divine principles, leaving echoes that still resonate in the hearts of those seeking answers in the sacred and the human. In the Quran, the role of women is as complex as humanity itself. They appear as companions, mothers, guides, and even warnings. Each story reveals a spectrum of human emotions, from the purest devotion to the boldest defiance. Among these narratives, 3 figures stand out whose decisions transformed not only their lives, but also the spiritual lessons drawn from them. Bilqis, the Queen of Sheba, rose as a powerful sovereign of a brilliant kingdom, filled with opulence and wisdom. Her initial polytheism was tested by the monotheism of the prophet Solomon, and in that confrontation, her life and her kingdom were transformed. Noah's wife, on the other hand, remained unbelieving in the face of signs and warnings, surrounded by a growing tide of doubts until the flood sealed her fate. And Lot's wife, torn between the world she knew and obedience to a divine command, made a decision that turned her into an eternal symbol of warning. These stories pose humanity's deepest questions. What does it mean to have faith? Is loyalty an act of surrender or defiance? And what is the price of our decisions when judgment transcends the earthly? Each of these women faced these questions with an intensity that transcends time, inviting us to reflect on the roles we play in our spiritual journeys. The journey begins with them. 3 women, 3 challenges, 3 stories that cross centuries as an eternal reminder of what it means to be human. Bilqis, the queen who turned her throne into faith. Bilqis was renowned for the greatness of her kingdom, a place where abundance and power intertwined with an opulence that dazzled even the most seasoned travelers. From her throne, forged with precious metals, she ruled a fertile land whose riches seemed endless. Every corner of her territory spoke of devotion to the gods worshipped in Sheba, temples reaching toward the heavens and ceremonies where the aromas of incense rose as constant offerings marked the daily lives of her people. But Bilqis was not just a queen of riches. She was also a woman of sharp mind and restless spirit. Her ability to rule with justice and wisdom was known far beyond her borders. The most experienced advisors sought her not just to receive orders, but to be enlightened by her intellect, which shone like a jewel among the adornments she wore. Yet, in her heart lingered a latent curiosity, a yearning to understand a power beyond the stone sculptures and golden idols erected in her temples. One day, rumors reached her court, rumors of a man whose wisdom transcended human understanding. A king named Solomon, whose faith in one God and governance skills were legendary. It was said that he could converse with animals, and that the winds obeyed his commands. Bilqis listened to these stories with a mix of skepticism and fascination, unable to ignore the seed of intrigue these words planted in her mind. What kind of power could stem from devotion to a single God? How was it possible for a man to achieve such a profound connection with the world? She decided to send him a message, a diplomatic gesture that was also a test of her fame and power. She sent envoys laden with treasures, gold, spices, and precious stones, a tribute worthy of a king like Solomon, but also a display of Sheba's magnificence. However, the response she received was as unexpected as it was perplexing. Solomon sent her a letter, a message speaking of a singular, omnipotent God, inviting her to abandon idol worship and embrace this faith. The queen read these words repeatedly, surrounded by her advisors. Some urged her to reject the message, deeming it a threat to her kingdom's sovereignty. Others warned her about Solomon's power, whose fame had spread far and wide. But Bilqis was not one to act rashly. She decided she needed to face this man personally, not as a subject, but as an equal. It was a decision that would change the course of her life and her kingdom. She traveled to Jerusalem, bringing with her a retinue that reflected Sheba's wealth and grandeur. Her arrival was a spectacle in itself, but when she finally met Solomon, what struck her most was not his power or his court, but his faith. In his presence, Bilqis felt something she had never experienced before, a mixture of humility and curiosity that led her to question everything she had held true. For days, they debated, exchanged knowledge, and reflected on the words Solomon offered her. As a demonstration of his wisdom, Solomon even commanded that Bilqis's throne be brought to his palace, an act that showcased his power and connection to the divine. This gesture marked a turning point in the queen's heart, leading her to see that faith in one God was not a threat, but a way to achieve a deeper connection with the universe. Bilqis eventually accepted Solomon's invitation and embraced monotheism. In doing so, she not only transformed her faith, but also the destiny of her kingdom. Under her leadership, Sheba adopted new forms of worship, leaving behind idols and recognizing the existence of a single God. This transition was not without challenges, as changing a people's beliefs requires time and patience. But Bilqis, with the same wisdom that had made her famous, guided her people toward a new path. However, the question remains, was this act a surrender or a challenge? Did embracing monotheism mean relinquishing her power as an absolute sovereign, or was it a display of a new kind of strength, a faith that led her to confront not just Solomon but also her own doubts and limitations? Bilqis's story leaves us with a lesson about the power of transformation and the search for truth, even when it leads us to question everything we know. Her journey from the opulence of polytheism to the humility of monotheism is a reminder that true power does not lie in thrones or riches, but in the ability to open one's heart to what cannot be fully understood. Noah's wife. The woman who rejected the ark of salvation. Noah's wife lived in a world where her husband's words were seen as madness by many around her. A man dedicated to proclaiming a message of warning and hope, Noah had spent years devoted to the mission he believed divine. He spoke of an imminent flood, of the wrath of a singular God who would bring justice to a world that had strayed from its purpose. But to his wife, those words were little more than a distant echo, something that over time became a constant source of tension in their home. She had grown up in a community where gods were numerous and traditions deeply rooted. Noah, with his insistence and unshakable faith in something that could neither be seen nor touched, was an anomaly to her, a source of bewilderment rather than inspiration. While he built an enormous ark in the middle of a dry landscape, she watched him with a mixture of disbelief and shame. What kind of man devoted his life to something so absurd? What kind of God would demand something so irrational? Over time, incomprehension turned into distance between them. Their relationship, once marked by closeness, began to crumble. She found herself increasingly aligned with the neighbors, who saw Noah as a delusional man. The whispers and laughter behind their backs were constant, and she began to resent the burden of being the wife of a man seemingly detached from reality. Meanwhile, Noah continued hammering the planks of the ark with unyielding faith in a purpose only he could understand. The tension reached its peak when the first signs of the flood began to appear. Clouds gathered in a sky that had always been clear, the air became unusually humid, and animals began behaving strangely. Noah insisted that the moment was near and that everyone needed to seek refuge in the ark. But to his wife, these signs were mere coincidences, natural phenomena that did not justify abandoning her home or her beliefs. When the day came and the rain began to fall, it was as if the heavens themselves had opened. Water poured not only from the sky, but also from the earth, quickly flooding fields and roads. People ran in all directions seeking shelter, while Noah and his family prepared to enter the ark. But she stayed behind, her eyes fixed on the floodwaters advancing ever more rapidly around her. Noah called out to her again and again, his voice filled with urgency and pain, but she did not move. In her heart, doubt remained stronger than fear. What kind of God needed to destroy so many to prove his power? What sense was there in following a man whose vision of the world was so far removed from reality? As the waters rose, she stood her ground, surrounded by those who, like her, refused to believe the warning. Finally, the water engulfed her with the same inevitability with which she had ignored her husband's words. In those final moments, as she felt the weight of the water dragging her into the depths, a spark of understanding seemed to cross her mind. But by then, it was too late. Noah and those who had believed his message were safe in the ark, while the world around them vanished under the judgment of the waters. The fate of Noah's wife serves as a reminder of the consequences of disbelief and the power of faith, but also of the complexity of human decisions. Noah saw in her a companion who had chosen to defy not only her husband, but also the voice he considered divine. To her, her choice was not a conscious act of defiance, but a resistance to what she could not fully comprehend. Her story prompts us to ask, how many times do our own doubts blind us to the truths before us? Lot's wife. The look that turned her into salt. Lot's wife lived in a city that had forgotten any trace of virtue. Sodom was a place where the hustle of markets and endless festivities hid a deep corruption rooted in every corner of daily life. There, greed, arrogance, and unrestrained pleasures ruled, and she found a certain comfort in this chaos because it was the world she knew and had grown accustomed to. Lot, her husband, had arrived as a stranger, bringing with him a message that spoke of a singular God, justice, and morality. But to her, this was always more of a burden than a guide. Lot's message was not only rejected by the city, but also made him a target of ridicule and threats. His wife, though she shared his home, never shared his faith. While he tried to warn the inhabitants about the judgment to come, she remained silent or even participated in the criticisms her husband received. Over the years, her heart grew hardened, not because she was wicked, but because her familiarity with sin had made her insensitive to its consequences. When the divine messengers arrived at Lot's house with their final warning, she listened to their words with the same mix of skepticism and apathy she had displayed all her life. Lot pleaded with the inhabitants to leave the city, to abandon everything they knew to escape imminent destruction. But to her, the idea of leaving behind her home, her life, and her community was inconceivable. What kind of God, she thought, demanded such a great sacrifice? The night judgment fell upon Sodom and Gomorrah. The sky lit up with an otherworldly glow as fire and brimstone rained down upon the land. Lot took his wife and daughters by the hand, urging them to flee without looking back. The messenger's words were clear. Salvation lay ahead, not behind. But every step she took away from her city was weighed down by doubt and nostalgia. As they ran toward the mountains, she felt the weight of everything she was leaving behind. The lights and sounds of destruction were not just reminders of judgment, but also of the life she had known and loved. In a moment of weakness, her gaze turned back, a seemingly insignificant act, but one deeply symbolic. It was a look laden with everything she could not let go, a mixture of disbelief, sadness, and attachment that sealed her fate. In that instant, her body transformed into a pillar of salt, motionless, like an eternal monument to disobedience. Lot and his daughters continued their journey as wind whipped up dust and ash around the petrified figure, now a silent testament to what it means to disobey divine commands. Lot's wife became a symbol, a warning that has transcended generations. Her story is not just a tale of judgment, but also a reflection on human attachment to material things and the familiar, even when it means rejecting truth and salvation. What makes us look back? What prevents us from letting go of what we know destroys us? Lot's wife was not punished solely for a physical act, but for what that act represented: her inability to break away from a world already condemned. This account compels us to confront our own backward glances. How many times do we cling to what we know cannot save us? How often do we choose the familiar over what is just or true? Lot's wife remains a figure that forces us to reflect, not just on her mistake, but on our own weaknesses and choices. The stories of these three women are rich with symbolism and resonance. Their decisions and destinies intertwine with the most fundamental questions of faith, morality, and the human condition. When we look at their lives through the lens of time, we see our own struggles, dilemmas, and frailties reflected. Bilqis, the Queen of Sheba, shows us that even the greatest power and the broadest wisdom can be transformed by the pursuit of truth. Her transition from polytheism to monotheism was not merely a change in beliefs, but a journey toward a deeper understanding of her place in the world and a relationship between the human and the divine. Yet her story poses a question that transcends words. Was her acceptance an act of defiance against her kingdom's norms, or a surrender to a truth she could no longer ignore? Noah's wife confronts us with the weight of disbelief and the consequences of resisting what we do not understand. She was not an evil figure, but a woman trapped in her own doubts, unable to see beyond the tangible. Her fate, drowning in the waters of the flood, is a painful reminder of what happens when warnings are ignored and signs dismissed. Her story invites us to reflect. How often do our own doubts distance us from what is true and just? Finally, Lot's wife, whose backward glance became an act transcending the physical, serves as a clear warning against attachment to a world that can no longer be saved. Her decision to look back was not just disobedience, but an expression of all she could not let go. She is a symbol of our own struggles to leave behind what binds us, even when we know we must move forward toward something better. Looking at these three lives together, a powerful pattern emerges. Each of these women faced a challenge that was both personal and spiritual. Their stories are not merely ancient accounts locked within the pages of a sacred text, but universal lessons that cross boundaries of time and culture. Each forces us to confront our deepest decisions, loyalties, and convictions. What do these stories teach us about faith, loyalty, and consequences? They show us that faith is not just an act of blind obedience, but a journey full of questions and challenges. They teach us that loyalty can be both a virtue and a trap, and that the consequences of our decisions echo far beyond ourselves. Their lives are mirrors reflecting our own internal struggles and dilemmas. Ultimately, the stories of Bilqis, Noah's wife, and Lot's wife are neither mere warnings nor heroic accounts. They are reminders of what it means to be human, of the tensions between the divine and the earthly, between what we know and what we can come to understand. Through their defiance of norms and confrontation with the divine, these women offer us a window into the human soul and invite us to reflect not only on them, but also on ourselves. The journey ends here, but the questions remain. What kind of faith are we willing to embrace? What are we willing to let go of to move forward? And most importantly, how will we face our own decisions when the divine and the human intersect on our path?